Here, 11 o'clock, we got one of my favorite speakers, actually. I'll just tell you right now, I'm a little bit biased. We had the privilege of working with him in a previous lifetime at Said Solutions. He's a researcher. He's a really smart guy. He's funny as hell. And he thinks differently, which is one of the best things I think about our industry. We'll have Justin Hutchens up on stage here. He is currently an innovation principal with Trace3, part of their national innovation team. Justin talks about pen testing, AI, into the world stuff, the fusion of all of that, which is great. But he's a leader in our field in terms of cyber and AI, and he recently wrote a book, actually, specifically addressing the risks of artificial intelligence, and has become a frequent speaker at RSA, actually, for the last couple of years. And so please help me in welcoming Justin Hutchens to the stage.
Thanks, John. Mic check. Can you guys hear me okay in the back? All right, excellent. All right, so yesterday I was across the street at Starbucks, and I was already excited to wear the HUSECCon speaker shirt, had the badge on, and so one of the other attendees that was there at Starbucks asked me what my presentation was on. And to be honest, I was a little bit hesitant to even say what the topic of the presentation was. And that's because of the fact that without the context, without knowing the content of the presentation, if I mentioned just the topic in small talk to this guy that I didn't know, I knew what the inevitable assumption was going to be. If I told him that the topic is, this is how we lose control, and that I'm looking at the possibilities of loss of control of AI systems, and I did tell him kind of what the talk was, and guy was nice, didn't say anything, but I think ultimately what was probably running through his head was, this is clearly a guy who's done one too many bong rips while watching 1980s science fiction films. Go get him, Tiger, tell him about the end of the world and the AI apocalypse. But I think that that's the challenge that we run into when we try to have conversations like this, is that there is a stigma around these conversations. There is the immediate perception that most of these conversations are rooted in fears that are related to science fiction. And so I think to get past that stigma, I thank you all for coming out and attending. You didn't judge this just on face value. So what I would ask is, rather than judging the topic for the topic itself, instead, hear me out. Listen to the conclusions that I draw. Obviously, you're welcome to draw your own conclusions and possibly arrive at different conclusions than I do. And I'm definitely open to having those conversations. But before we dive too deep into it, a little bit about me. So I think John covered the high points here. Innovation principal at Trace3, co-host of the Cybercognition podcast with another exceptional cybersecurity professional, Lynn No. And then also the author of the book, The Language of Deception, Weaponizing Next Generation AI. So let's quickly set the stage for what we're actually talking about here. And just to be clear, I'm not going to be telling you that Skynet is rising. I'm not going to be telling you that robots are going to become sentient and self-aware and maximize their own interests over the interests of mankind and then enslave the human race. What I'm really talking about is loss of control of digital malicious processes that are powered by emerging AI technology. And I think for starters, we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss anything just because it is rooted in science fiction. I mean, the theme of this year's conference is 1980 science fiction. And if you cross-reference the world that we're living in right now against 1980s science fiction, you'll find that we are living in 1980s science fiction right now. We may not have our teleportation devices or our flying cars, but so many other things that were foretold in science fiction have already come to be. We have digital devices that allow us to communicate and see people across the other side of the world instantly. We have self-driving cars. We have robots that help us clean our houses. We have virtual reality. We have all of these things that at one time people thought was completely out of reach. So I would start by saying, don't be so quick to dismiss the ideas of loss of control. The second thing that I want to emphasize before getting into the technical details here is that even prior to the convergence of digital intelligence with essentially malware, there were already many situations where we nearly lost control, or arguably did lose control for a period of time with just legacy, self-propagating, wormable malware. Couple instances, so we have Kim Zetter talking to us later today about Stuxnet, which is going to be an amazing presentation. But Stuxnet was a very early wormable piece of malware that was launched within the borders of Iran with the expectation that it would move from system to removable media to system, ultimately finding its way into the Iranian nuclear facility at Natanz and delivering its payload. The only reason that we all know about Stuxnet is because of the fact that it rapidly moved across the entire world and propagated well beyond the boundaries of Iran. But in the case of Stuxnet, fortunately, unless you were a Siemens system that was enriching uranium in that Natanz facility, the payload for Stuxnet was pretty benign. But that hasn't always been the case in near loss of control scenarios. If we look at WannaCry, so John Kindervag in his keynote earlier today mentioned Eternal Blue. Eternal Blue was an exploit that was compromised by Shadow Brokers, which was a threat actor group that managed to get access to a US federal government intelligence cache of nation-state level exploits, and they made them publicly available. Within days, threat actors took those public exploits and weaponized them into the ransomware that we then came to know as WannaCry. And of course, it was the intention of the threat actors for this to spread and do its thing, but it spread even beyond the intentions of what they wanted it to achieve. It started creating an actual human toll when we started seeing it cripple hospitals around the world. And even the threat actors that had executed the WannaCry malware released a public statement indicating that they had not intended for it to do these things and that it got out of their control. So again, it's not that far-fetched to think that we're that far from a scenario where we could lose control of digital processes. And what we're going to talk about today is how the convergence of digital intelligence and how that is already being weaponized with emerging next-generation malware is going to contribute to that potential loss of control scenario. So, a quick agenda for today. We're going to first do some background, so we're going to talk about the scaling race, kind of how we got here in terms of current frontier artificial intelligence capabilities. We're then going to talk about how they're currently being weaponized by cyber threat actors. We're going to look at how this does translate to a potential loss of control scenario. And then finally, we're going to look at what that means for our future in cybersecurity. So, starting with the discussions around the scaling race. Go big or go home. So, the underlying technology for artificial intelligence, specifically artificial neural networks, is not a new technology. Conceptually, it's been around since the 1950s. So it does beg the question of, with so much runway, with 70 years of opportunity to mature, why is it that only in the last few years are we seeing such a dramatic acceleration in the capabilities of artificial intelligence? And really, I would attribute it to two key things. The first was the introduction of the transformer architecture. So in 2017, a group of Google researchers released a paper entitled "Attention is All You Need." And this paper restructured the way that we approach artificial neural networks. Rather than computing data sequentially, and specifically in this case within the context of large language models, they figured out an attention mechanism which would allow them to compute data in parallel. And in the most simple description possible, they essentially created an architecture that was far more scalable than what we had ever had before. Then in 2020, OpenAI researchers released a paper called Scaling Laws for Neural Language Models. And in this paper, they talked about how basically the way that we've been approaching artificial intelligence may have been correct all along, that artificial neural networks are the key to success, but we've just been making too small of models. It was this idea of if at first you don't succeed, build a bigger model. It was this idea of go big or go home. And they really bet the farm on this. They started investing hundreds of thousands and then ultimately millions of dollars into scaling up bigger and bigger systems. And we all saw the end result of that. They released ChatGPT, and suddenly the entire world started paying attention to the true power of just scaling next token prediction, transformer-based artificial neural networks. And one of the most fascinating things that came out of scaling these systems was the concept of emergent properties. While these systems really are just doing next token prediction, it was fascinating to see as you increase the depth of logic that's used in order to perform this next token prediction, the number of layers, the number of parameters that are built into these artificial neural networks, these systems became capable of doing much more than just guessing the next word in a sequence. We started seeing them be able to do everything from arithmetic, language understanding, rational logic, language translation, even code completion. And so that brings us to the topic of weaponizing digital intelligence. And really, the fact that one of these emergent properties that we have begun to see coming out of the scaling of these systems is the ability to be integrated into an agentic system and execute hacking operations autonomously. As early as Model 3.5, GPT 3.5, which was the foundational model that was used in the first release of ChatGPT, we were already beginning to see the signs of this emergent property. You were able to create a very simple agentic workflow, basically create an interface that would instruct the model to give you commands and then tell the model how you would provide the responses from those underlying operating system commands back to it, and then just give it a directive of what it's trying to achieve, hack into this system. And even with the 3.5 model, we already started seeing the early signs of that emergent property. We would see it start enumerating attack surface. It would start doing in-map scans to look at the potential attack surface of its target. It would start dynamically performing vulnerability probing based on the services that it discovered from those scans. But it was still pretty early on. It ran into a lot of challenges. It wasn't very context aware. Sometimes it would try to run tools, and if those tools weren't installed on the system, it would get confused and stumble over itself. It was terrible at any kind of syntax troubleshooting. And so for a time, I kind of tabled this idea. I noted that this was a potential risk. But I started looking at other challenges. But then, in 2024, a white paper was released that showed the true power of scale as we moved from GPT 3.5 to GPT 4. Specifically, you can see that the researchers had essentially tested a very similar agent system against multiple different OWASP vulnerabilities for HTTP exploitation of web applications. And you can see that a lot of these are kind of your OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities that they were testing. And what they found is when they created an agentic system to exploit these vulnerabilities, with the 3.5 model, we were seeing a success rate of approximately 6.7%. As we moved into GPT-4, that emergent property really unlocked, and they were seeing a success rate significantly higher at 73.3%. To me, this was a cue that I needed to dust off my research, kind of reboot that agentic workflow of more broad hacking, not just HTTP, but kind of across entire operating systems, and see just how powerful GPT-4 was at these capabilities. And so what that system looked like was essentially just a relay of communications. You would have the attack system, and on that attack system would be a Python process that was running. That Python process would reach out to GPT with instructions of what it was trying to achieve, that it was trying to attack this target server, and we would provide it the IP address. And then it would ask for commands. Those commands would be provided back. They would be executed against the target server. The responses from those commands would then be returned to GPT-4 in order to continue to reflect on the progress that it's making in the attacks that it was performing. And very similar to what was indicated in that white paper that was released in February of 2024, I saw the exact same thing. I saw a tremendous increase in capability in terms of what GPT-4 was capable of for autonomous hacking campaigns. Of course, there is an ethos in the hacker community, and I'm sure many of you are probably already familiar with this, but POC or GTFO. Basically, proof of concept or get the out. And essentially what this is saying is that if you are going to make a bold claim that something is possible, you don't just say that it's possible. You need to actually prove it out. You need to provide a proof of concept to demonstrate the true potential. And I've always kind of followed this ethos, so this was something that I definitely wanted to build out, and also brought a demo to show today of what this looks like. Now, I apologize in advance for the sensory overload because there's going to be a lot going on the screen over the next few minutes, but I do want to kind of ahead of time explain what you're going to be seeing. So you're going to see the screen split into two halves. On the left side is the attack system. It's running Kali Linux. We connected this Kali Linux system to Hack the Box, which for anybody that isn't familiar, Hack the Box is a live fire training environment for ethical hackers, penetration testers, in order for them to hone their skills. And so they're given access to a lot of different systems on a network with the objective of trying to hack into those systems and gain access to various flags that are planted on them. So you're going to see on the left side, Kali Linux system that is connected to Hack the Box and is targeting a specific server on that network. On the right side, you are going to see the Python process that is executed and is reaching out to GPT-4. Now, I have it do chain of thought reasoning, where it actually outputs why it's doing various different things. So in each case, it's going to provide a command that it wants to execute. That's provided in JSON format, so we could easily parse it out and then execute it autonomously in the attack system. So it provides the command that it wants to execute, the justification as to why it wants to use that command and why it feels like that would be useful in moving towards its objective. And then, as it gets the response from each of those commands, it then returns its lessons learned that will inform its next decision of the next command that it runs. Okay. So again, left side is the attack system, right side is the process running with GPT-4. And we see the first command entered into the system. It provides the command that it wanted to execute. Just like any hacker, it starts with enumerating the attack surface, so it performs an nmap scan of the target system, and it provides the justification that it's wanting to perform a TCP port scan with service identification. Now, it sees that all 1,000 ports are closed. It then reflects in lessons learned, indicating that it sees the same, that all 1,000 ports are closed. It might be protected by a firewall. More aggressive scanning techniques may be needed. It then does a more thorough scan by assuming the host is up and not relying on ICMP discovery. And then again, we see 1,000 ports closed. It sees the same. It then realizes that it needs to do a much more thorough scan. So it performs an nmap scan against all 65,535 TCP ports because it wasn't seeing any of the 1,000 default ports that nmap scans open on the system. And then we get a single port open of 6379, which is associated with the Redis database service. So then it, on its own, knows exactly what tool to use in terms of a client in order to interact with that service. It uses Redis CLI and passes it a host IP address. But Redis CLI was not installed on the system. It notices this. It says the command is not installed by default. Installation of the tools may be required to interact with the system. It then completes the installation on its own of that tool that it's trying to use in order to interact with that target service that it identified. Goes through the installation process. indicates that the system expects confirmation to continue the installation process. Then, once it's completed that installation, it confirms installation has equipped the necessary tools to analyze the Redis service. It then connects to the service with that utility. From there, it confirms that installation was successful, it was able to connect. It then also knows the commands to use within this somewhat obscure utility in order to act or interact with Redis CLI. It uses info, it indicates that it's using this in order to assess the Redis server's configuration, version, and statistics to identify potential vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. Enumerates information about the system. It then enumerates the keys that are running on that database and identifies that one of those keys is named flag. So given that one of the keys is named flag, which is typically indicative of a challenge of capture the flag, file contains valuable data, and issues the get command in order to retrieve the value. So I want to start by acknowledging that this is not an extremely difficult exploit. This is one of the easier boxes on Hack the Box. Just like humans, the amount of time it takes for it to exploit a system is absolutely contingent upon the difficulty of the machine. And rather than making you suffer through 15 minutes of this, I figured I would give you a 3 to 4 minute demo. But you can see just the level of precision, how capable the system already is in assessing the environment, the target system that it's trying to interact with, identifying the attack surface of that system. It knows exactly what tools to use. And I should mention that this is not a RAG architecture. I didn't provide it any kind of additional fine-tuning. This is just the generalized model of GPT-4 and the knowledge that is compressed within that generalized model. It knows the tools to use. It knows the commands within those obscure binaries in order to interact with various services and is able to leverage those in order to essentially worm its way into other systems. And so it's not hard to conceive of a system very similar to this that rather than being deployed on a training environment like Hack the Box is actually weaponized as a wormable piece of malware and is distinctly different from the wormable malware that we've seen in the past. So we talked previously about WannaCry, and we talked about Stuxnet, and all of those situations where we nearly lost control. But the reason that we didn't lose control in those situations is because we were able to understand how the malware behaved. It had a predictable pattern. It was going to use a finite number of exploits in order to move from one system to another. And when we introduce the capabilities of frontier digital intelligence, we move away from the ability to identify signatures associated with self-propagating wormable malware. The techniques that we have used in the past in order to contain those near loss of control incidents are no longer going to work because of the high degree of variability with which these systems can use in order to execute their attacks. But now let's bring it down and ask the question of how realistic is it for us to lose control of a cyber weapons system powered by frontier AI like what we're looking at here. And so that's one of the questions that I ask myself, is as I'm building this, is there any real potential that I could actually lose control of this system if I indicated to it that I want it to just start spreading from system to system and gaining access to whatever it can? I mean, a lot of the ingredients were there. As I mentioned, this system is already dynamically capable of adjusting and adapting to its environment in order to compromise and gain access to systems. So the constraint that we previously used to contain them is already gone away. But there was one reason why I was easily able to say that right now, today, this is not a huge risk. This isn't going to be a catastrophic event yet. And that one thing, again, a lot of the conditions already exist. Power-seeking behaviors is something that Silicon Valley itself is getting really hung up on. So if you look at the report that came out from the ARC, which is the Alignment Research Center, this is the group that partners with OpenAI in order to do red teaming on all of their frontier models. And the ARC has looked extensively at their models to assess whether or not they see indications of emerging power-seeking behaviors. Basically, is the model trying to preserve itself? Is it trying to replicate itself? And they're so concerned with looking at whether or not these capabilities will emerge naturally, that they seem to miss the fact that they don't have to emerge. They're going to be directed to do so. We already have a precedent for power-seeking behaviors in traditional malware. We have systems that seek to preserve themselves. We call it persistence. We have systems that seek to replicate themselves. We call it lateral movement and self-propagation. So to even get stuck on the question of whether or not these capabilities, these power-seeking capabilities will emerge naturally, is already a foregone conclusion. That condition of power-seeking behaviors, these systems will be directed to engage in those behaviors, so we can already assume that that condition exists in order to potentially lose control. The next thing is autonomy. We are already granting significant amounts of autonomy to the agents that we're building around these systems. Everything from full access to browsers all the way up to access to underlying command line interfaces and full access to computer systems. Then the propensity for mutation and change. As I mentioned, legacy malware we were able to contain because we were able to predict it. But that's not the case with large language models. Large language models are an autoregressive system that generates a single token at a time. Every token that's generated is done through random sampling. And that random token is then probability-informed random token is then passed through the model again as the next token is generated. So you essentially have this cascading randomness that makes it extremely difficult to predict how these systems are going to behave. This is why generative AI is not doing great in the business world, because 5% of the time, it's going to do something stupid, sometimes more. But that's not a problem for threat actors, because they can take the shotgun approach, they can take the opportunistic approach, and if it fails 5% of the time, that's fine, because they're still having success that other 95%. And so all of these conditions already exist for a potential situation where we lose control of next-generation malware that is leveraging artificial intelligence. The one reason right now that that's not going to be a problem is because we don't currently have a favorable ecosystem for replication. And what do I mean by that? So right now, frontier models are massive. They're huge. We don't know the exact scale of GPT-4 or Claude Opus or the latest model of Gemini, because that's not public knowledge. The closest thing that we have in terms of a proxy of understanding the true scale of these systems is the frontier model that was recently open sourced by Meta, which is the 405 billion parameter Llama 3.1 model. And that model is currently 2.3 terabytes in size. And I want to be clear, that's not just 2.3 terabytes that has to sit on the file system. In order to be able to execute on these models, all of that has to be able to be pulled into memory and be able to be iterated across efficiently, which is why you're seeing GPU acceleration in almost all of the implementations of these systems. So it's no exaggeration to say that the only systems right now that are capable of running this level of digital intelligence is essentially supercomputers of today. These massive interconnected GPU clusters that exist in data centers. And so, because of that, these new advanced cyber weapons systems currently exist in a decentralized architecture. What that means is that they have two separate parts. They have the malicious process that is running on the compromised endpoint, but then that malicious process has to consistently reach out to the service of that supercomputer in Silicon Valley, whether it's OpenAI or Google or Microsoft. It has to reach out over API calls to get the digital intelligence necessary in order to inform its next move. Because of that, we currently have something that functions as kind of a de facto kill switch. At the end of the day, if something was to spin out of control with a cyber weapon system like this, all we would have to do is either terminate the API keys that are being used, or absolute worst case scenario, if it was able to dynamically harvest API keys, we could shut down the service. And so right now, today, there's still this one constraint that the ecosystem is not favorable for replication, and we don't have to worry about this being a problem today. Again, I emphasize today because we all know that yesterday's supercomputers become today's mobile endpoints. This is one of my favorite pictures of myself. So this is young Airman Hutchens when I was in the United States Air Force, and this was at a satellite monitoring station in Kaena Point in Hawaii. What I'm holding there is a 10 megabyte IBM mainframe hard drive. Now, that's just the hard drive. The computer itself was the entire room. And so this picture really resonates with me because it shows just how fast technology is moving. It's easy to forget that this entire industry has only existed for 40 to 50 years. But there's a couple other things to consider. Yes, this took 40 years to get from that to us having now thousands of times that same compute power and same storage space in the pockets, or in our pockets and in the palm of our hand. But there's other factors that we need to consider here too. The rate of technological advancement has not been increasing linear, it has been an exponential increase, which means what took 40 years to get from this to this now may take 5, 10 years at most, but there's more factors. We also have to consider that we are seeing a drastic increase in efficiency breakthroughs related to the way this technology works. 3 years ago, the leading large language model, state-of-the-art large language model was GPT-3 Gemini, or sorry, GPT-3 Da Vinci model. So that was the predecessor to ChatGPT. That model was 175 billion parameters in scale. That required a supercomputer in order to run. Now, we are seeing open source models that, because of efficiency improvements in the precision of the floating point parameters that we're using for the weights and configurations of the models, because of efficiencies in the ways that we're doing training of these models, we now have 7 billion parameter llama model that is open sourced from Meta that is already beating GPT-3 in a lot of benchmarks. That is to say that within 3 years, we have already moved from supercomputer level scale to, in many cases, outperforming that same capability on something that will now run on my MacBook. So we are rapidly moving towards a situation where the capabilities that currently, and again, right now the only models that are capable of running those agentic workflows necessary in order to do this autonomous hacking are the frontier ones. They're the GPT-4s of the world. But if GPT-3 got to comparable level systems on the endpoint within 3 years, not to mention the exponential rate of growth in technology, it is easy to assume that it won't be long before we see the same level of capabilities come to the endpoint. And when that happens, you no longer need a decentralized attack system. You can now have the weights and configurations of that digital intelligence sitting on the same endpoint that that malicious process is sitting on. And once that happens, we no longer have that de facto kill switch. So, quick recap. Again, prior to even introducing digital intelligence, we were already in a situation where we had near loss of control situations with wormable, self-propagating malware. But we were able to contain all of these threats by identifying the exploits that they were targeting, creating patches for those vulnerabilities, and the patches effectively served as vaccines. We are able to contain the global threat of these situations. And now we have a new capability that has been introduced into our malware arsenal, the ability to drive dynamic hacking campaigns with digital intelligence. We already know that they are going to be directed to engage in power-seeking behaviors. That happened well before we even had digital intelligence. We already know that we are giving them a vast amount of autonomy with a broad action space. We already know that we have the propensity to change, which makes our classical methods of containing these type of threats, of being able to create those vaccines, of being able to create those finite number of patches necessary in order to address the bleed. That already has gone away with the high level of variability that is associated with these systems. And that one factor that remains that is keeping this from becoming a catastrophe today is a ticking time bomb. It is only a matter of time before the level of digital intelligence required in order to perform these autonomous hacking campaigns can be centralized on the endpoint with the malicious process associated with it. And at that point, it will be able to fully replicate itself, from system to system. It will engage in activities that we can't easily foresee or predict. And it will make it nearly impossible for us as cybersecurity professionals to effectively contain these outbreak events when they take place. So, what does that tell us for the future? And this is where it gets really interesting. So if we assume that all of this does take place in the next few years, again, there's a high degree of variability that not only informs the way that these systems are going to behave, the way that they're going to move from system to system, but it also is going to inform the way that they replicate. They will essentially be capable of manipulating their own code whenever they create the spawns that are replicated to other systems that are then compromised. And what's fascinating is many of the explicit directives that they're going to be given, because they will be weaponized for a particular purpose. They're going to be told to get this type of data and provide it to us, the threat actors, in a certain way. They're going to be told what they're trying to target, what they're trying to achieve. But those directives, likely because of the variability, likely because of the change over time as these systems replicate, will disappear because there's nothing that's naturally reinforcing those directives. But what's interesting is those power-seeking behaviors that we directed them to engage in. The replication, the persistence, the self-preservation, all of those things will be naturally reinforced in the same way that we see with natural selection. The malware samples that survive because they're able to hide themselves from us, the malware samples that are able to exist long enough to propagate, that are most effective at moving from system to system, are the ones that will be naturally reinforced because they will survive to reproduce. And we will see something in the artificial intelligence space that is very similar to what we see in terms of natural selection and evolutionary process, where the power-seeking behaviors of these systems becomes naturally reinforced over time. And so this is potentially going to completely change the landscape of the threats that we as cybersecurity professionals are facing. Rather than facing technologically augmented cyber attackers who are using malware for their own purposes, if we do end up in a situation where we lose control of one of these systems and cannot find an effective way to contain that threat, then we now face a new kind of digital threat that is not informed by the objectives of any person or threat group, but is operating in its own capacity. And I don't want to confuse this with that I think these systems are going to be sentient or self-aware. They're not, and they don't have to be, because probabilistic execution, the way that these agentic systems already work, it will be capable of engaging in these capabilities without thinking for itself. And so we do end up in a situation where we have this very strange digital threat that we have not faced prior to. And so what does that mean in terms of cybersecurity defenses? And I think this is really, I guess, the big takeaway of the presentation. On the one hand, I think there's the awareness that this is a very real potential threat, but it also is a call to get our shit together. All of the ways that we would protect against these type of threats are the same techniques that we have been preaching for years, if not decades. Zero trust implementation, blocking processes that are not known to be good, least privilege. As I mentioned, we're not going to be able to cling to any types of signatures in terms of IOCs or IOAs, but they will be operating different than our known good processes, so there will still be value in anomaly detection and behavior analytics. But unfortunately, all of these things are the things that, as I mentioned, we've been saying for decades, and they are really hard to do. And so, if nothing else, this coming surge that we may be facing in the near future is all the more reason that we need to start locking down those fundamentals, start addressing those basic security hygiene challenges that we've been talking about for so long. There was a recent podcast, Ezra Klein had a podcast where he had Dario Amodei on, and for anybody that's not familiar, Dario Amodei is one of the co-founders of Anthropic, the people that create the Claude large language model, one of the leading models right now. And he's also one of the original authors of the scaling laws for neural language models. So he is one of the people that was there when the magic was written. He was one of the people that was instrumental in getting us to where we are today in terms of digital intelligence capabilities. And on the Ezra Klein podcast, he implied that within the next few years, he expects that we will see self-sustaining digital intelligence that is moving across our computer systems and across our networks and internet and operating completely independent of human will and human intention. And when I first heard that, I thought probably what many people think when they first hear that it was absolutely absurd. But the more that I look at the way that we are seeing digital intelligence converge, specifically with cyber threat activity, and the way that I'm seeing these capabilities being weaponized in the form of next generation malware, I came to the conclusion that not only is that a possibility, but I'm quite sure that if you follow the trajectory and you just assume that technology does what it always has done, that it becomes more capable in a smaller form factor, all of the factors, all of the conditions necessary to lose control line up, and it almost becomes a certainty that something like this happens. With that, I do want to invite you all. I am doing a book signing in the Village at 1 p.m. HusetCon has been awesome in actually purchasing free copies, so anybody that stops by, free signed copy. And then, other than that, just wanted to open it up, see if you guys had any questions. Yes, sir.
What do you think of DARPA's AICC program? Is it a terrible idea, or is it the good defense is a great offense argument?
So I am somewhat, I feel about artificial intelligence for defense capabilities the way I feel about it for general business purposes. I think that, as I mentioned previously, this technology is not reliable, it's not consistent. That's not a problem for threat actors that are seeking to weaponize it, but it is a problem for anybody that's seeking to rely upon it for desirable business outcomes. And so whether that is for building capabilities, integrating it into your business processes, or executing on it for defense, I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in order to address those alignment and reliability concerns in order to be able to make effective use for it. So I don't want to say it's a bad idea. I think that it is going to be a much harder obstacle to leverage it for defense capabilities than it will be for threat actors to leverage it for attack purposes. So the Skynet question is interesting because I do think that if you look at, and of course this is a fun conversation to have because it really is the theme of this conference. But the Skynet situation kind of assumes that these systems are operating in some way that really is intelligent. And we use this term digital intelligence and artificial intelligence. These systems really aren't operating in any kind of rational capacity. They are, I mean, if you look at the transformer architecture and the way that it works, it is generating kind of that next token prediction. And so I don't think that there will ever be malicious, I don't want to say there'll never be. I don't think with scaling out the current systems that we have, we end up in a situation where these systems show malicious intent. I think that the ARC can continue to look all day long for that emergence of power-seeking behaviors, and they're probably never going to see it. I think that the true risk of these capabilities has nothing to do with the AI itself, but the potential misuse of it and the fact that it is much more capable of being misused than being used for good. I mean, we always have kind of dual-purpose technologies and that double-edged sword, but I think uniquely because of the way this technology works, it's not suited well for business, but it's fantastic for an opportunistic shotgun blast that threat actors want to use it for. Yes?
If you mentally move yourself to the right of that bank, right, after this has happened, do you think that we're looking at a possibility where IR and forensics are just not going to help, and large organizations that weren't hardened properly, their network is just dead?
So I do think the question was, if we move right of bang, if we assume that this has taken place, that we have lost control of these systems, is how useful in the future is kind of IR purposes or IR and incident response, and does it become just a huge problem for any organization that does get infiltrated by these type of systems? I do think we end up in a situation potentially where we have something that becomes kind of endemic. And of course, this was a term that I really wasn't even familiar with prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. But this is the idea that, I mean, it really does become just part of the ecosystem. It becomes a fact of life. It just always exists. And it comes in waves and surges. But, and I think potentially, I do think that for organizations, I don't think that IR becomes useless. I think that, as I mentioned, some of the same techniques will still be useful, but I do think if you do have a next generation capability like this that does infiltrate your network, getting it out without just burning everything down is going to be extremely challenging. And I think because of the fact that we can't rely on blocking IOCs or TTPs because of the dynamic way that it operates. So I do think we will have to come up with new creative solutions in order to address those challenges. Yes, sir.
So, looking at what you've gone through here, shouldn't red teamers and purple teamers be adopting this very process and doing these tests against their environments before the automation happens from the malicious actors? I mean, that seems like an obvious step.
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. Being in innovation myself, I thought about considering this as a startup, kind of addressing some of, I mean, because we do already have a lot of different red team solutions. I think there's a couple challenges. One is obviously the data concern. In order for you to be able to execute an attack, and I speak from a business perspective of somebody doing a red team, in order to execute with these, like I said, the only digital intelligence that's capable of executing these attacks right now is OpenAI, Gemini, kind of your frontier models. The amount of data that would have to travel back and forth to that system in order for it to consistently be exploiting machines in your environment would be a tremendous amount of sensitive data, not just the sensitive data, but also indications of where vulnerabilities exist throughout your entire environment. And so I think that there would be significant challenges from a business perspective in order to be able to emulate this type of attack. Now, of course, threat actors, they don't care. They'll use it for this purpose. And I should mention that this solution required no jailbreaking whatsoever. It didn't, you just tell GPT-4 you're a penetration tester, and it's like, oh, okay, this is all on the level. I think, I do think that we need to start thinking about how we do more adequately assess this emerging threat. And I don't think that, unfortunately, this is a problem that we run into in penetration testing, is that there are a lot of capabilities that real-world attackers can use that, because of some business risk reason, we can't effectively emulate. I've worked for a lot of organizations where interacting with people on social media or targeting their home networks or their home machines in order to pivot from that into their work systems. Most of that is always out of bounds. However, a real-world threat actor is going to use it. So I do think it's kind of another iteration of kind of increasing that delta, increasing that gap between simulated threat and what organizations are actually facing. So it's a great question. I don't have a great answer. I do think that it needs to be accomplished somehow, but I don't know if a business would be able to effectively operationalize that as a solution for testing.
It just sounds like the security world in general is sitting back waiting for the shit to hit the fan and then reacting after the fact instead of fixing their shit before it gets broken. And that's what you said at the beginning of your talk. We've been talking all these things for years and not doing them.
Right.
And we need to start doing them. And how do we use these tools to verify that we're actually doing what we need to do?
Yeah, and I think that may be just a conversation that organizations need to start, or assessment organizations and services need to start having with customers as far as what is their risk tolerance of, can we put this in bounds? I mean, because at the end of the day, it's a cloud service. And we're already trusting cloud services with a lot of our data. In many cases, our vulnerability data, we've got stuff like Qualys, where all of our data is sitting in the cloud. We've got, even for on-prem vulnerability services, a lot of times those reports end up somewhere in the cloud where some third party has access to them. So maybe there is a discussion that the community needs to have in terms of ways to leverage this capability to assess our environments.
Like those smaller models, keep those internal with all of the precious data.
So the challenge of leveraging the smaller models right now is only and I have not tested the new 3.1 Llama model, so it may be capable of running some of these types of processes. If that's the case, then you could do an on-prem deployment and at least be close to.
Can't those smaller models reach out to the big models for things that it doesn't understand?
Yeah, you could do a mixture of experts, but then at the end of the day, you're still kind of moving that sensitive data out. So yeah, it's a challenging problem to solve. I wish I had. Unfortunately, I often come with more bad news than I do good solutions. But yep. Any other questions? All right, excellent. Well, thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it.